What if I told you there was a year so dark? The sun vanished from the sky for more than a year. A year when crops failed across continents, when cities starved, and when empires trembled beneath a sky of ash. This isn't science fiction. This isn't myth. This is history. Historians now agree 536 AD was the beginning of the most harrowing decade in recorded human history. But what caused it? Was it a volcano, a plague, a punishment from the heavens? And more importantly, could it happen again? Let's journey back to the year when the world went dark and humanity stood on the brink. The year 536 AD does not echo with the glory of battles or the rise of great empires. It is not a date engraved in triumph. Yet to those who lived through it, it was the year the world ended, slowly, silently, without a single sword drawn. That year the sun rose but did not shine in the heart of the Byzantine Empire. In Constantinople, the historian Procopius penned a line so subdued that it almost went unnoticed. The sun gave forth its light without brightness, like the moon, during the whole year. At first, people blinked at the dim sky. They waited, but the days did not brighten. The darkness lingered, not as night but as a permanent dusk, spreading across continents like a shroud. The sun, ever the giver of life, now hung pale and distant, a ghost in the heavens. In the fields, crops refused to grow. The earth remained cold and damp. In the workshops, fires burned low, metal cooled too quickly. In the forests, birds grew silent, animals moved cautiously, and the wind carried the scent of Ashdod in Syria, far from Constantinople. A monk named John of Ephesus recorded his fear. For nearly a whole year, the sun rose but shone not. The land was cold and wet. Crops failed. Hunger spread. In Egypt, the Nile flowed weakly. Monks gathered not to sing but to pray for the sun's return. In China, snow fell in summer. The harvest failed. People resorted to grinding tree bark, boiling roots, and eating insects. Starvation crept from village to village like a silent predator. In Ireland, a scribe wrote 6 chilling words. A failure of bread from 536 to 539. Not because bakers disappeared, but because there was no wheat to bake. In Japan, priests believed the ancestors were displeased. In Scandinavia, myths began to stir visions of Ragnarok, the twilight of the gods. The darkness had awakened something far older than science. Fear across continents. The same terror echoed in different tongues. People gazed upward in confusion, hoping for answers, but the sky remained mute. The sun, though still there, had become unreliable, diminished like a god that had turned away, and slowly, society began to unravel. Livestock starved. People wandered from their homes in search of food, only to find the same barren earth elsewhere. Trade routes quieted. Kingdoms grew suspicious of their neighbors. The darkness was not just physical, it seeped into the soul. Candles flickered dimly. Fires burned with a strange reluctance. Even flame, the oldest companion of humankind, seemed weaker in this new age of shadows. There was no explanation. No one in 536 knew what we know now. It was not the wrath of gods, not a punishment, not the end of the world foretold in holy texts. It was ash, ash from a place no one had mapped, no one had seen, no one suspected. Somewhere in the far north, perhaps in Iceland or even beyond, the volcano had awakened. It erupted with such force that it spewed millions of tons of sulfur and ash into the upper atmosphere, forming a veil that wrapped around the globe. That veil stole the light. This was not the end. It was only the beginning. The sky had dimmed. The crops had failed, and the people had begun to die. But what followed in the next years would be worse than darkness, worse than cold, worse than hunger. What came next was the plague. The year was still 536, and though the sky had dimmed and crops had failed, the people still did not understand what had happened. But above them, in the invisible layers of the stratosphere, the earth had been wounded. The wound had come from fire, from the fury of the earth itself. Modern science, centuries later, would uncover the cause. In the icy cores of Greenland and Antarctica, hidden within compressed layers of snow and ancient ice, researchers would find something remarkable. A sharp, sudden spike in sulfate particles, frozen in time. It was the fingerprint of a massive, volcanic eruption, possibly more than one. Though the exact volcano is still debated, many point toward Iceland. Somewhere amid its glaciers and peaks, a mountain had shattered. The blast hurled millions of tons of ash and sulfur into the sky, launching it high enough to reach the stratosphere, where winds carried the particles across continents. This ash didn't simply fall. It floated, it spread, and it lingered. The tiny sulfuric acid droplets formed a velar global haze that filtered out sunlight. The result, a dramatic and immediate drop in temperature worldwide. This was not an ordinary volcanic winter. It was a planetary blackout. The earth cooled. The winds shifted. Rain patterns broke. Seasons lost their rhythm. The world had entered what climatologists now call the late antique Little Ice Age, a period of climate collapse that would last more than a decade in China. Historical records from the Northern Wei dynasty reported. Yellow dust rained from the sky. The summer was cold. The fields did not yield. People died by the thousands. In Korea, annals noted frost in midsummer. In the highlands of the Andes, tree rings stopped growing. Even the oceans responded. Coral reefs showed signs of stress. Glaciers began to expand. Ecosystems faltered. In Europe, entire villages were abandoned. Rivers froze early. Wolves ventured closer to settlements, drawn by hunger. Farmers, unable to sow their fields, bartered. What little they had for dried grains or salted fish they could find it. Global agriculture collapsed. Without predictable sun and rain, harvests withered. The food chains, both natural and man-made, began to crack. Hunger spread across the continents like an invisible plague, touching rich and poor alike, and with hunger came desperation in Scandinavia. Archaeologists have uncovered mass graves from this period, evidence of rapid population loss. Entire settlements vanished without a trace. To the Norse, this time would be remembered in myth as Fimbulwinter, the great winter that came before the end of the world. In Ireland, the annals of Ulster recorded repeated failures of crops and a great death. In Mesopotamia, where empires once bloomed under golden sun, canals dried, and famine choked the life from cities. What made this global disaster even more terrifying was that it came without explanation. The people of 536 had no science, no satellite data, no meteorological models. They only knew what they saw. What they saw was the sky darken, the cold deepen, and the world grow silent. Religious leaders cried out. Prophets emerged. Some blamed sin. Others warned of doomsday. Priests in Christian lands declared the dim sun a sign of divine judgment. In Zoroastrian texts from Persia, scholars recorded omens of smoke and darkness. In India, Astrologers noted strange alignments, bad omens, and cursed eclipses in Constantinople. The heart of the Byzantine Empire, Emperor Justinian I, watched his realm weaken. The roads grew quiet, trade slowed, food prices soared, revolts simmered beneath the surface, and then, in 539, just when the people began to believe that the worst was over, it happened again. Another massive eruption. Evidence from ice cores in Antarctica suggests a second volcanic blast occurred. Just 3 years after the first, possibly in Central America. 2 global-scale eruptions, back-to-back, within a single generation. The second wave of ash compounded the disaster, prolonging the climate collapse. The people were trapped in a world they no longer recognized. Many turned to superstition. Stories began to circulate of children born with glowing eyes, of beasts seen walking on 2 legs, of lights in the sky and screams from the woods. These were not facts, but symptoms of collective trauma. When the world breaks, the mind seeks, meaning even if it must invent monsters. But monsters were not needed. Nature was enough. The world had changed, and though few understood why, everyone knew one thing. They were now at the mercy of something greater, something colder, something darker. This was the age of ash, the beginning of a cascade that would tear across empires, shape myths, and rewrite the fate of millions. But the ash was not done yet. It had dimmed the sky, shattered the climate, and starved the land. Now, it would open the door for something far more lethal, a plague that would sweep across continents and leave no corner of the world untouched. The year after the sun dimmed was not one of recovery. It was one of reckoning. By 537 AD, the hope that the skies would return to normal had withered just like the crops across the continents, in lands from the British Isles to the rice paddies of China. The silence of failed harvests was only broken by the sounds of desperate hunger. The earth had turned on its children. In Europe, farmers knelt in fields of withered grain. Entire communities stood under the grey, sunless sky, hoping for rain, warmth and thing that would breathe life back into the soil. But the climate had shifted. The volcanic ash and sulfur that once painted fiery sunsets now blanketed the atmosphere in cold, even in summer. The days were chill and damp. In Italy, once the heart of empire, famine tore through the countryside. In the marketplaces of Rome, food was scarce, and prices soared beyond imagination. A loaf of bread became worth more than a day's labor, and for those without gold, there was only hunger. The old, the young, the poor, they died first. In Gaul, records describe families abandoning their homes to wander in search of food. Forests once feared for wolves became filled with ragged humans, scouring for roots, nuts, or the occasional small animal. Children were buried without coffins. Graveyards overflowed. Monasteries tried to help. They opened their storerooms, gave out barley and rye. But even the monasteries were running out. In the east, things were no better. In Persia, the once mighty Sassanid Empire faced its own collapse. Trade routes from India and China dried up as merchants chose survival over commerce. Caravans became targets for roving bandits. Roads that once echoed with the sound of wheels now fell silent. In the far corners of the Chinese Empire, entire provinces reported famine. In the annals of the Northern Wei dynasty, strange weather was recorded: frosts in summer, snow that fell during the time of planting, families ground tree bark to mix with millet, some boiled leather shoes for soup. In Ireland, the chronicles continued their bleak march of words, the failure of bread. The people wander, The land is cursed. But the earth was not cursed. It was choking. The invisible veil in the sky blocked sunlight and changed rainfall patterns. Crops like wheat and barley, dependent on delicate seasons, could no longer grow properly. Even in Egypt, the breadbasket of empire's grain exports halted. The Nile's floods were weaker. Farmers along its banks watched as harvests failed 2 years in a row. The granaries emptied. Hunger, however, was only the beginning. What hunger begins, desperation completes. In some regions, warlords rose, not for land, but for food. Peasant revolts broke out. Villagers raided one another. Travelers were robbed not for silver, but for sacks of oats or dried meat. In Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire, Emperor Justinian heard reports. From governors, empty villages, mass migrations, starving cities. But there was little even an emperor could do when the sun refused to shine. He ordered new storage granaries built, but there was no grain to fill them. He lowered taxes on farmland, but the land produced nothing. He prayed. The empire prayed. But prayers do not feed the hungry. And still the ash remained above them, drifting in the stratosphere, far beyond the reach of human hands or hope in the face of disaster. Human nature split in two. Some turned to charity, shared what little they had. Monks walked barefoot to distribute dried lentils. Bishops sold church treasures to feed the poor. In Syria, some monasteries opened their doors to travelers, offering beds and broth to those near death. But others turned savage. In Northern Europe, pagan cults reawakened. Blood sacrifices were performed to call back the sun. In the Slavic lands, the old forest gods were invoked once more. In Iceland, oral traditions speak of a time when the sky cracked and the earth wept ash. Even in Christian lands, fear cracked faith. Some whispered that the end of days had truly come, that the darkened sun was the fourth trumpet of Revelation, and that famine was only the first of the seals to be broken. Communities fractured, families split apart, villages were abandoned overnight, and then, from the east, came a new horror. In 541 AD, just 5 years after the sun had dimmed the worst, pandemic in recorded human history arrived. A ship docked at the Egyptian port of Pelusium. Its cargo carried more than trade. It carried fleas. The fleas carried rats. The rats carried death. The Justinian plague had begun. In a world already weak, cold, and starving, disease would bring the final blow. But that is a story for another day. The world was already on its knees. By the early 540s, humanity had endured nearly a decade of darkness, starvation, and despair. Crops had failed. Societies had fractured. Entire regions had emptied as people abandoned homes in search of anything that resembled hope. The ground was cold, the sun dim, and the old order trembling. But the worst had not yet come. Somewhere in the distant east, from the steppes of Central Asia or the harbors of East Africa, new enemies stirred. One not of ash or famine, but of flesh and breath. It traveled silently at first, hidden in fleas, carried by rats, stowed aboard merchant ships sailing from Egypt toward the Mediterranean. By the time it reached the great port of Pelusium, it had already begun its slow, malevolent march through the arteries of empire. People began to cough, then shiver, then swell. In 541 AD, the great city of Constantinople, the crown jewel of the Byzantine Empire, stood unknowingly at the edge of annihilation. Its markets still opened. Priests still chanted in Hagia Sophia. The Emperor Justinian, rebuilding his shattered empire, sat on his golden throne with plans for conquest, and then the bodies began to fall, first in ones, then in dozens, then in thousands. The disease struck with terrifying speed, high fever, buboes the size of eggs, swollen under the arms and at the groin. The skin turned black. Delirium set in. Most died within days. Many within hours. It was the plague of Justinian, the first true pandemic in recorded history. By the time it was recognized, it was already too late. The city of Constantinople, already weakened by food shortages and unrest, became a hellscape. Entire districts were silenced, corpses piled in the streets. So many died that the emperor ordered mass grave trenches miles long. And when those filled bodies were stuffed into buildings, into cisterns, into the sea, the living were too few, too weak, or too afraid to bury the dead. Procopius, the same historian who once wrote about the dimming sun, now recorded something far more horrifying. At that time, there was a pestilence by which the whole human race came near to being annihilated. In just a few months, it is estimated that between 1/3 to half of Constantinople's population perished. But the plague did not stop there. It spread outward like fire from a burning house. Syria, Palestine, Anatolia, Greece, Italy. Balkans none were spared. Then to Gaul, to the Isles of Britain, to the distant coasts of Iberia. Over the next 2 years, the disease carved a swath of death across Europe and the Middle East, as if the darkness of 536 had returned this time in the form of plague. And it kept coming back. The plague of Justinian would not be a single, tragic event. It returned in waves for the next 2 centuries, hammering generation after generation. Just as one group began to rebuild, another wave would arrive, undoing all progress. It created a cycle of trauma and collapse that reshaped the very fabric of civilization. Farms lay abandoned. Cities emptied. Soldiers deserted their posts. Trade routes withered. Knowledge was forgotten. Entire languages began to fade. In the West, what remained of Roman order finally disintegrated. In the East, the Byzantines, once the last hope of imperial continuity, became hollowed and weak. Even Justinian, the emperor himself, contracted the plague. He survived, but his empire never truly recovered. This was not just a health crisis. It was a civilizational wound. And unlike war, where the enemy could be seen and fought, this enemy was invisible. It lived in the air, in the water, in the touch of another human. It killed rich and poor, priests and peasants, generals and beggars alike. No one was safe. No one was spared. By the end of the 540s, the world that had entered the 6th century still, clinging to the remnants of Roman glory, had collapsed into something else, something darker, smaller, more fearful. A world of empty roads, shuttered temples, ruined towns, and whispered prayers. A world that had seen the light dim, the food vanish, and now the people themselves disappear. But the story of 536 does not end with plague. It continues as a battered humanity struggles to rise again into a new, uncertain age. Even as the skies began to clear in the late 540s, the world that existed before 536 was going erased, not by fire or conquest, but by a slow and merciless unraveling. The century that followed would bear the scars of this dark turning point. Entire civilizations, once proud and thriving, would either vanish or emerge forever changed. And in their place, a new world would rise, shaped by hunger fear, and resilience. The Byzantine Empire, though battered by the plague and social unrest, struggled to regain its footing. Justinian's dream of a reunited Roman Empire lay in ruins, not from battle alone, but from nature's quiet revolt. In Western Europe, kingdoms fragmented, infrastructure decayed. Roads, once vital trade routes, were overgrown and silent. Cities, emptied, not by war, but by slow abandonment. In this silence, the knowledge of the ancients dimmed. Fewer could read, even fewer could build in Britain. The post-Roman landscape became a patchwork of warring tribes and desperate settlements. In Scandinavia, where sunlight had once been a rare luxury even in good years, population collapse sparked mythic memory. Norse legends speak of Fimbulwinter, a great 3-year winter before the end of the world. Was it born from 536? Perhaps, after all, the line between myth and memory is often blurred in the dark. Further east, in Central Asia and China, the consequences echoed as famine and instability set off migration waves, tribal pressures, and political fractures. The Northern Wei dynasty in China collapsed soon after. In India, trade declined, and inscriptions grew fewer. Across the world, the written record fades not, because people forgot how to write, but because they had more urgent concerns: to survive, to plant, to hope. And yet, amid this descent, seeds of transformation took root. The survivors who endured the famines, the plagues, the winters would become the ancestors of the world that emerged in the centuries to come. The silence of the 6th century gave way, slowly, to new voices, new empires, and new faiths. In Arabia, the stage was quietly being set for a movement that would reshape the known world, Islam, in Europe. The early medieval period began, not with glory, but with loss. Yet from that loss came new beginnings: monasteries, preserving knowledge, oral traditions, keeping stories alive, communities learning to rebuild, one stone at a time. Historians now understand that the year 536 was not just a bad year, it was the gateway to what scholars call the late antique Little Ice Age, a period of global cooling and turbulence lasting more than a century. The volcanic eruptions of 536 and 540 were only the beginning. Tree rings, ice cores, and ancient texts together paint a picture of a planet under siege, not by one cataclysm, but by a series of cascading disasters. And this matters, because when we speak of the worst year to be alive, we are not just recounting a moment of suffering. We are remembering a fracture point in human history, a reminder of how fragile our systems are, how dependent we are on the thin veil of stability that weather, sunlight, crops, and trade provide, and how easily that veil can be torn today. In a world more connected than ever, it is easy to imagine we have moved beyond such ancient catastrophes. But the echoes of 536 remind us that nature has no memory of our plans. The ash can still fall, the sun can still grow dim, and the question remains: if it were to happen again, would we be ready? So the year 536 lingers not just in history, books, but in the very bones of civilization, a silent warning veiled in dust.